Yeah, thank you for that, Lynn. And Sharon is not going to be with us in the next couple of weeks, I understand, and I'm going to be sending out the reminders. What I did earlier, just about 15 minutes ago, we're going to be talking today about an apocryphal gospel called the Proto-Evangelium of James. It was written, in the middle of the second century. Yeah, I'm just going to be talking about it. Of course, Fredrickson brings it up in her book, but I thought, there's so much available to us now on the internet. You can find just about anything, and so I found a link where if you have an interest, you can read the entire gospel, and it's a little longer than it is too long for me to read it to you over, our in our class here. But some of the, we'll be talking about it with some pretty broad strokes today. Uh, but it would be interesting to me to hear what you have to say when you read this, because knowing how you have in the past several years come to be in your own right biblical scholars, using critical theory to think about how texts were developed and when they were developed, and what the context was like. I'd love to hear what your analysis is of this, because there are some things in it that are very familiar and there are some things that are not familiar. But we'll get a chance to talk more about that. But I sent it to you as a link just about 15 minutes ago. And then after we have an introduction to it today, you'll have a chance to read it for yourself. Very interesting stuff, especially when you consider that, let's call it mythology. Some of the mythology that's found in this gospel has become doctrine, really, in the Roman Catholic Church. Uh, it just, which raises the whole question of, how, on what does the church found its doctrines, and so enjoy that if you will. Any questions or reflections on where we've been before we get started? We are in chapter 6 still, and I suspect that we will conclude that chapter today. So, any thoughts?
Uh, Dan,
Yeah.
I just appreciate what Paula Frederickson has done in chapter 6 so much, and I may have mentioned this before, in terms of helping me understand the origin of celibacy, within the Catholic Church in particular, um, which, I never ever understood.
Right. Yeah. This was something, I mean, we can read the gospel, not the gospels, we can read the letters of Paul and some of the, early church writings in the Bible and see that this conflict is going on. And it's really how I want to introduce our conversation today, because what we're seeing here is, I think, the greatest demonstration of a conflict that is the result of a Greco-Roman, but primarily a Greek worldview and a Hebraic worldview coming together. And the church, obviously, in the first 5 centuries, employs a lot of Greek philosophy in its methodology. And in so doing, you can't help but take on those categories, which are not always consistent with, what you have inherited from the Judaic tradition. And what do I mean by this? Well, uh, when you consider what it means to be human, I mean, the perennial question that we in the humanities try to answer. What does it mean to be human? What is our essence? The Greeks answer that question in one way, and the Jews answer it in an entirely different way. Um, we ended last time with a discussion of Origen and how Origen was one to try to put together a systematic theology that tried to explain, what happened in the garden and how we have come to this situation. And the one aspect of our being that is that brings us face to face with death. I mean, this is something that Freud and some of the psychoanalysts since the late 19th, early 20th century have been reflecting on. There's this connection between sexuality and one's death, this utter vulnerability you feel in your sexuality. Well, is this part of what it means to be human, or is this an aberration of some sort, right? That keeps us from being human? Is sexuality, something to be upheld as, a fundamental aspect of our humanity, or is it something that stands in the way as a stumbling block for us to achieve our true humanity? Well, the Greco-Roman worldview was going to, and I'll mention here mostly the Greek worldview, especially when it gets mixed in with Persian ideas, Persian ideas of that come from Zoroastrianism that was encountered by the Jews in the 6th and 5th century BCE. But the idea in Greek philosophy is that essential part of human beings, which is eternal, is our soul. And the soul is encased, you might say, in a body that is, subject to the changes of time and space, right? There is an aspect to our body that is not subject to time and space, that is eternal, you might say. Um, and we'll see this when we talk about Origen here. Uh, and so there's this conflict between soul and body. Body is the thing that is bringing us down and keeping our souls from ascending to the heights of truth. Now, by contrast, you have the Jewish tradition. So in the Greek tradition, there is a dualism between body and soul. One is you might even say the enemy, depending on, I don't want to say that about the Greeks, but certainly in Zoroastrianism, the soul is evil. With the Greeks, excuse me, what did I just say? In Zoroastrianism, the body is evil, right? And the soul is good. And it's the soul's destiny to try to free itself from the chains of the body. In the Greek tradition, the same language is being used, but they don't talk about good and evil as much as they do, um, you know, uh, I guess less good than good, right? But all of that gets inherited by Christianity. Now, by contrast, we have the Hebrew tradition. And if you know the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and God's creation, especially Genesis chapter 2, where God is, in the garden and he creates out of the earth, remember, which we've seen from the previous chapter of Genesis, which is created good. Everything has been seen and created as good. And he creates out of the good earth a human form. And this is the word Adam comes from Adamah, the dirt out of which Adam is made. And then God breathes the breath of life, ruach, into Adam. And Adam becomes a living soul, literally a person. There, you take soul, you take either one of those things away, and they are non-existent things. In order to be a person, you must be a combination of the Spirit of God and that enlivens, that inspires, literally inspires the body. So apart from the body, there is no spirit per se. There's no soul per se. And apart from this enlivened aspect of the body, there is there's no being. Human beings are beings because they are flesh and spirit come together. That is a soul. And both of those things are good. The breath of life, as well as the body that is enlivened by that life. But there is no little secret center called a soul in Judaism. So which of these is going to be inherited by the church? And the conflict that we see is a conflict between a Greek metaphysical, reality and a Hebrew metaphysical reality. We know that there are some who, want to promote celibacy. Paul was one of these, right? But lo and behold, Paul was a Greek speaking Hellenistic Jew who was no doubt influenced by this Greek worldview. But there are others, who in the early church who really want to emphasize the Hebraic tradition in which the body is seen as created good by God. And therefore, sexuality is not seen as a hindrance to the body, but is seen as something that's been ordained by God as, for the means of procreation. And then actually, even in the early church, there were people doing what we were calling chaste marriages that, don't go too crazy with it, but sex is good as long as you're procreating, right? Later on, reformers, and we have to tip our hat to people like Calvin and Luther, who would say, no, sexuality is a means by which human beings can, uh, strengthen their emotional tie with each other, which is intended by God. So sexuality does not have to have as its objective procreation exclusively. But in the early centuries of the church, the first 5 centuries, we see this conflict happening, right? Are we going to capitulate to the Greek understanding of human beings as essentially alienated from their bodies, which are bringing them down, or are they going to capitulate to the Hebrew side of things, which says that body and spirit together is what God intended in creation. So this is what this whole chapter is about. But and this is where we left off last time. Uh, but it was a conflict in the first several centuries. And Origen of Alexandria, in the second and third century, well, he was writing in the third century BC, or excuse me, third century of the Common Era. He was the first to try to put together this cosmology, you might say, or let's call it cosmogony, how the earth was created. How did this material existence come into being? So I got to speak on that just a little bit last time, but I wanted to pick up there because Origen is going to be representative of the Greek philosophical, Platonically derived uh, uh, tradition. And we're going to find out that later he is going to be deemed a heretic. But in the third century, when he's writing, he provides the first systematic understanding of what it means for human beings to live as, these embodied souls, as these, characters that we are. So what are your comments about that, or thoughts about that? That's a long introduction. Sorry.
Dan, could you reflect on, you know, we're talking about a tiny percentage of the population arguing these, how many angels can you put on that head of a pin? Uh, but is there some kind of awareness, on the part of the church, early church fathers, of how how the Greek populace viewed sexuality, which was pretty pretty relaxed. Uh,
Yeah,
that's my impression.
yeah. And because there was so much sexuality and much of the, I mean, think of the Bacchanalia, the Dionysian cult, right? Because there was so much sexuality, and this is the same with the prophets, in the 8th century BCE or 9th century, because sexuality was such a draw, away from the church, on the part of the pagans and engaging in these rituals where they would get drunk and they would dance in the streets and, enjoy their bodily existence through sexual intercourse all night and into the morning, that kind of thing. Well, I mean, there's something kind of attractive about that, right? So uh, it almost precipitated a natural inclination on the part of the church, lest the baptized members of the church be drawn away from paganism to emphasize the debauched character of or the secondary nature of the body. The body is something as a stumbling block, right? Um, the body is something that can bring you into uh, God's disfavor, those kinds of things. And so we see pendulum leaning more towards the celibacy side of things, perhaps because of that context that we're talking about. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Greek pagan tradition certainly uh, spend a lot of time in the bodily pleasures, not just sex, but eating and drinking and all of those things that are uh, so attractive to so many people. So, anything you want to add to that, Denny?
Meant to say, the early Christian fathers probably found that absolutely revolting and totally unacceptable.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
Greek populace way of living.
yeah, yeah, right. Um, well, anyway, there were aristocrats, let's call them. There were intellectuals who were trying to describe, just how all of this came about. And one of them was Origen. And I mentioned him last time, and he was the one who wrote on first principles. And what he was trying to do was to explain why it is that we have this material existence, we ourselves. We want to affirm that, God is a good God. God is all powerful. Uh, but at the same time, God is unembodied. God is not embodied. So how is it that God creates a world in which embodiment is like the fundamental category, right? You start any type of philosophical reflection on human experience is going to begin with time and space, right? That's how we locate ourselves. We are uh, occupiers of space that can experience the passage of time. But apparently, God, because God transcends time and space, does not experience that. So how is it that we came to occupy this realm, this three-dimensional realm of time and space? Well, here's what Origen proposes. And if you're a fan of The Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien, if you read the Silmarillion, it, I mean, he does a wonderful job of, this is like the prequel to the prequel of The Lord of the Rings. He really does a pretty good job of fashioning his own cosmology and cosmogony in the beginning of the universe, uh, that reflects what Origen is talking about. In the beginning, there is no beginning. There is nothing but eternal time, right? Because God does not live in time. So God is one of these beings who is eternally generating, and God's spirit overflows into these beings, and these beings have what are called spiritual bodies, right? Um, and over the course of their existence, these spiritual bodies, we might refer to them as angels. And also read into this the beginning of our later stories about how Lucifer fell from grace and all of these. Over time, these angels start to develop their own sense of self, right? And they start to turn away from God. And the further and further they turn away, there is a need for some sort of, reconciliation, some sort of redemption. All but one of the angels turns away. And try not to think about this in terms of time and space, because these things always existed. They were never created. They were just simply a reflection of God's overflowing abundance of grace. Only one of these beings uh, refused to turn away from their love of God, and this being's love of God was so great that he was one with God, so perfectly aligned. And this is the Logos. This is Christ. But all of the other beings fall away from that. And so God has to come up with a means by which they can return to the source. And God, out of God's providence, out of God's grace, creates the material world. And it's in this material world that these beings are going to be able to learn what they need to learn in order to return, uh, to their source. The implications of this are two. Well, there are many, but the two that are really important for us here is every being who exists, you and I, and the animals, and every being exists is one of these uh, spiritual bodies who has taken on a material existence. And the implication is that their soul, if they do not learn what they need to learn in this realm, their soul will be reincarnated in in another form based upon their previous lives. It's very much like the Hindu tradition of samsara, or in the Buddhist tradition of samsara, of reincarnation. But the implication here is really important. Souls are eternal. They were never created. Your soul is one of the original souls that was reflecting on God. The other implication of this is that there's this universal claim that God has on all of these beings. Eventually, all of these fallen beings will return to God, even Satan himself. This is a reflection of God's graciousness. So that was really the first attempt at trying to explain how it is that we came to be these enfleshed beings. The implications: universalism, the eternality, the eternalness of the eternity of the soul, as well as this implication, very Greek, that this world, this material world, though created good by God, is really not our true home. And it's only a step away from that before you start to say this the world in which we live is not a good place to live. Well, let me stop. And can I clarify anything about this? We're about at page 164 in our text. And this is where Fredrickson does a very good job of explaining on first principles fairly well. Any questions? Well, remember, Origen is not the only person reflecting on this. And by the middle of the 4th century, for reasons that are not entirely clear, to me at least, emphasis upon a more literal reading of Scripture came to be the norm. And Adam and Eve were not seen as these metaphorical characters, but they were seen as actual beings. And therefore our progenitors, those our predecessors. And so the question was, what happened in the beginning with our original parents that has led us to this point where we feel, this natural sense of alienation, this natural sense of this disorientation of existential angst in all things. And the focus started to become on not so much the resurrection of the spiritual body, which is what Origen would have emphasized, but on the resurrection of the flesh, you know. And more importantly, yeah, that's like a little tangent that we could go off on, but the thing that Fredrickson wants to focus on is there must have been something that happened through the sexual act that resulted in the sin that we all have inherited. And questions like, well, had Adam and Eve never fallen, had they had never been disobedience, would there have ever been sexuality? And some were saying, no, there wouldn't. I mean, we would have procreated in a non-sexual way that did not have to fall into the debased, act that is now the source of our procreation. And this is reflected in this gospel story that I've mentioned to you called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is a story that has its origin in questions about, well, if we all inherit something of Adam's sin through the sexual act, right? Then what does that say about the incarnation of Jesus? Because we've been assuming that Jesus was sinless. So how in the world could that have happened if he was the son of Mary and Joseph, or even just the son of Mary and the Holy Spirit, right? There had to have been something that prevented Jesus from inheriting original sin. And this is where the whole emphasis that was starting to evolve at this time on Mary as a virgin and Mary's celibacy, right? And that ideal of the virgin. The virgins were just below the martyrs in terms of their righteousness in the eyes of God. Well, obviously, something had to be reconciled with how Jesus was born of Mary. The Holy Spirit naturally wouldn't have contributed to the sin, but Mary was still human, right? So there had to have been something that was tricked out a little bit so that Jesus did not inherit human sin. And we know about the importance of Mary's virginity because we've already seen that it's established in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. And especially in Matthew, where the emphasis is on the Isaiah 7 passage where to fulfill the prophecy of the Old Testament, look, the virgin shall conceive and the virgin is conceived and is with child. And that just as an aside, I think you remember us talking about this. In the Old Testament, in the Greek version, the Hebrew word Alma does not mean a young woman who has never had sexual intercourse. It simply means a young woman who is of marriageable age. However, when that Hebrew word got translated into Greek in the Septuagint, the Greek word Parthenos came to have the implication that this is a woman who has never, had sexual intercourse. So the misreading, really, the misinterpretation of Isaiah comes to be established in Matthew, and it won't be long until, a century later that people are saying that Jesus was born of a woman who did not have intercourse with Joseph. And this is what the story suggests, right? Especially, in Luke when Gabriel appears to Mary and says, "You're going to be with child." She says, "How is that possible? I've never been with a man." Well, this story gets later developed in the third and into the fourth century by a gospel writer who's trying to explain how it is that Jesus is born of Mary and does not inherit Mary's sin. If Mary's a human being, she's obviously, has sin inherited from her parents. So the story goes that, and well, let me stop right there. Do you have any questions or comments about this? Because the story I'm about to tell you is going to be something that, is fairly well known in the Catholic tradition, but not so much in the Protestant tradition. Well, the story, if you read it, and I sent you the link, has been very influenced by some of the Old Testament tropes. First of all, there's a couple by the name of Joachim and Anna. And Joachim's a very rich man, and he sacrifices double to God what he needs to, but he's never had a child. And then his wife, Anna, feels herself to be uh, completely bereft because, you know, she she says things like, I look at the birds and look at the animals, how many of those are incapable of procreating? But here am I, utterly worthless. I can't have a child. So you're seeing some of the themes that we see from the Old Testament. And Anna makes this deal, if I have a child, I am going to dedicate this child to the service of the great God of Yahweh, of Elohim. And very much like the Samuel story, right? When Hannah gives Samuel makes a deal with God. Hey, if you make me pregnant, I will, or if you if you give me a child, I will dedicate this child to the priesthood. And so this happens, and Anna gives birth to Mary, and Mary, somewhere between the ages of 3 and 12, we don't know exactly, the stories differ, is taken to the temple. In Anna is a woman of her word. She takes Mary to the temple and gives her to the priest there. She becomes part of the what we might call the Vestal Virgins, though they weren't referred to it as, but uh, they were the ones who I think somebody's at my door. Can you excuse me for a minute? I'm sorry. That's the trouble with being at home. You got the Mormons coming by. No, they weren't the Mormons, but anyway, Mary is dedicated in the temple and she serves as one of the handmaids, basically. And she does her duty. Interestingly, she is tasked with the job of creating the veil that separates the Holy of Holies from, the outer precincts of the inner temple. You might remember that that veil is what is torn in two when Jesus is crucified. Well, the tradition goes is that very veil is what is the veil that Mary spent her early childhood sewing and creating herself. But the time comes for her to be married, you know, and uh, she is presented as, you as being of the age of marriage. But the men who come to the temple to marry her, among them is a man by the name of Joseph. Joseph's got his staff there. He's this old guy, kind of looks like me, sitting in the back, like, yeah, what chance do I have for the priest to, give me this child, right? And in the gospel itself, apparently a dove comes out of Joseph's staff and lands on Joseph's head, which is, the international sign that this is This is the guy who's supposed to marry this child. And so the child is given to Joseph, but with the understanding that they will never consummate their marriage. Now, this does some interesting things, right? Because what it does is explains how it is that Jesus had brothers and sisters. We know from Mark that his brothers and sisters are trying to, keep him from acting so crazy, and Jesus says, "Who are my brothers? Who are my sisters?" Well, it's pretty clear from Mark that Mary has brothers, has children other than Jesus. In fact, Jesus is like the younger one, right? Um, well, it's now explained that Joseph was a widower. Joseph had children with another woman prior to, his marriage to Mary. And then it was a matter of Jewish law. You marry the second wife becomes the mother of those children. So you've explained how it is that Jesus had brothers and sisters. But more importantly, you also explain how it is that, Mary was able to remain a virgin, those who had all of these children. Well, the upshot of all this, lest I go on and on, is that Mary gives birth to Jesus. And believe it or not, in this story, there is an actual gynecological exam, believe it or not. A woman by the name of Salome comes and says, "I can't believe that this young girl is giving birth to a child with no blood or anything like that, and that she's still a virgin." So, by the way, the story picks up the way, they have to go for the census, and they end up staying in a cave, and that's where Jesus is born. But this midwife comes and actually gives Mary a test, right? She inserts her finger and finds that, sure enough, Mary is still a virgin. And so thus begins this tradition of the perpetual virginity of Mary. Remember, the virgins are the ones who are most highly esteemed in the church. But there's also this idea that it is through the sex act and through human birth that sin comes into the world. Well, Jesus wasn't born in that way. Jesus wasn't born the way that he wasn't born as the result of the union of a man and a woman. It was the Holy Spirit. So he was able to maintain his sinlessness, right? Uh, but questions on, the implications for the incarnation really abound after this, right? If Jesus was, sinless, was he truly a human being? If Mary was sinless, was she, you know, truly a human being as well? And so there's this idea of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which is part of the Roman Catholic Church. Mary was not conceived by a man and a woman. Mary was conceived the same way that Jesus was, by the Holy Spirit. Well, if you carry this out to its logical consequences, right? You have to ask the question, well, what about Anna? You know, Anna had sinfulness, right? Didn't Mary inherit some of that from Anna, her mother? And then you've got what they say is turtles all the way down. You've got this regression that goes all the way back to, uh, the beginning of time. But apparently, this solved the equation. How was it that Jesus was sinless? Um, so you can read the firsthand account, so to speak, in that link that I sent you. But I find it really interesting because, even with just a rudimentary knowledge of Scripture, you can see where uh, uh, traditions from Scripture have been inserted into the tale, right? And then it has been filled in. The missing blanks have been filled in by this, elaborate tale. So this image I have here for you is a Russian icon. And this tradition is in the Orthodox tradition as well. This is the young Mary. You can see her with her little nimbus here. Joachim and Anna. presenting them to the high priest Annas, Annas, I believe was a high priest at the time, and she's about to begin her life as a celibate, child devoted to the worship of God, devoted to the care of the temple. Uh, and it's from this ritual context that Jesus is going to be born, immaculately conceived and born. So any comments about that? Kind of makes you want to be Catholic, doesn't it? I'm not trying to downplay the Catholics at this, but it's just, there are a lot of stories, a lot of doctrines that come out of stories that develop in this, in centuries after, the person of Christ. So,
Yeah, Dan, it's just amazing. You get all of this doctrine and these convoluted and complicated, comprehensive, I'll call them stories,
yeah,
based on simple misinterpretations.
right.
And look what it's caused. Look what it has caused.
Absolutely.
Because I think to most critical scholars will tell you Jesus was not born of a virgin.
Yeah. Yeah.
End of story. Okay. Next question.
Right. Right. Well, it is interesting to note that there's an archetypal aspect to this idea of being born of a virgin, you know, and this is where we see, some influence from probably the Greco-Roman uh, mythologies, but probably one that we were not aware of. In other words, there were godlike figures who were born of virgins, right? Of gods who, who take advantage of a female woman or of a female, and that demigod is born. But there's also the story of Siddhartha Gautama, who died 480 BCE, and so 500 years prior to this. But the myth that developed around this is very, very similar. Siddhartha Gautama, his mother was named Queen Maya, and her husband was the great king, and she asked that her husband not have sexual intercourse with her. But one night she falls asleep. She has a dream of an elephant taking a lotus, flower and touching her belly with it. And she wakes up the next morning and she realizes she's pregnant. Interestingly enough, 9 months later on a trip, she's not in the palace, but very much like Joseph and Mary, she's going on a trip. And in the middle of the trip, she comes to deliver the child. And the child he's not delivered the way that normal children are, right? No blood, no mucus, none of that. But he pops out of her side and takes 3 steps and says, I'm now the king of the world. I finally conquered samsara, and I will be, I am Buddha, right? So these fantastic stories are created to try to demonstrate or to try to um, impress upon the hearers that, yes, this is no typical human being. And thus, our redemption, our salvation comes truly from heaven, not from just some human being who is, subject to all of the foibles and downfalls that we have. So there's this archetypal aspect to it. These are aspects of birth stories that are found around the world. And Christians just adopt them as their own as well. There's something in the human psyche that says, no, it has to be this way. Well, this one also has the advantage of explaining how it is that Jesus was sinless, though, I mean, the logic doesn't work out, but, for the faithful, it works out. Um, so anyway, any thoughts on that? Any further questions? I've really talked too long today. I'm sorry about this. Well, the whole idea of, well, now we know that the flesh is sinful. How did it come to be that way? And how is it that we come to be redeemed? And this is where the great controversy of the fifth century, the so-called Pelagian controversy, really creates a watershed for the church. You know, there was a man by the name of Pelagius, originally from Britain, the British Isles. And if you know anything about Celtic spirituality, many of the Celtic Christians or those in the Celtic mystical tradition uh, claim Pelagius to be their saint, you know. The rest of the church, however, sees Pelagius as a heretic, as this little diagram I have and demonstrates. Pelagi hereticus, the heretic Pelagius, right? Uh, but Pelagius, it kind of plumbs a line between Origen on the one hand and Augustine, who is going to be his nemesis on the other. And by this time, Origen has been reviled as being heretical. They want to say that the souls are not eternal. The souls are created in human, at conception, right? They do not simply are created out of previous souls, or they're not souls that have been reincarnated. So the church is pretty clear on that. So there's something in the sexual act that creates the soul. And what is it that the soul, what characterizes the soul when that act is complete and when that child is born? And Pelagius wanted to say, hey, look, every soul is born perfect. Every soul is born innocent, let's put it that way. And it's only a matter of the context in which it finds itself that it recapitulates the sin of Adam. Conceivably, it could be such that, a soul could be born and never sin, right? According to Pelagius. But what happens is, as a matter of free will, uh, souls do what the original spiritual bodies in Origen's cosmology do, is they turn away. They get caught up in their own sense of self, and they recapitulate the act of Adam, the original sinfulness of Adam. But for the most part, human beings have free will, and human beings can choose the path that they want to follow. Pelagius also said, answering the question, sex is natural. It's not something that, came about as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve. Had Adam and Eve never sinned in the garden, human beings would still be born, sexually, right? They would be born through procreation. It was part of God's procreative purposes. So sex is something to be, held up as, as part of God's divine plan. But souls are born blameless. Now, this gets to the heart. We haven't really talked about Augustine yet, but Augustine's not going to have anything to do with that. But really, this gets to the heart of something that's very American right here. In the United States, there was something known as the Second Great Awakening. And the question of predestination, are all souls destined by God to either be saved or to be condemned, came really to offend a lot of Americans, because, it didn't jibe with the American way of being, right? We are independent people. We make choices and things like that. So it was at this time that the Methodist tradition of, emphasizing the human being as a person who has mastery over his own will, and that through moral choices we can, achieve a likeness with God, or at least a, a righteousness that God can recognize. That is really a continuation of what Pelagius had to say. Human beings are given free will by God, and that free will is still intact. It's only out of their ignorance or their selfishness that they choose not to follow the way that is very clearly set before them. St. Augustine, here's the famous photo of St. Augustine holding the burning heart, right? This is when he feels his heart burning within him after hearing a passage from Romans. St. Augustine was going to agree with Pelagius that sex is ordained, but there are a number of things that have changed about human beings since Eden, right? Like Pelagius, sex would have been part of, the equation. Human beings would have been born through procreation, even if Adam and Eve had not fallen. But the nature of the fleshly body has changed as a result of that sinfulness. Originally, I'll just go over these briefly and we'll pick up with these when we come back next time. Originally, Adam had the ability to direct the passions of the body by his mind. No problem, right? His will was able to do this. But since the fall, the soul has lost the ability to choose rightly. The mind is so sullied that it no longer has control over the body. And then how did that happen? How is it that, we inherited that? And it was inherited through the sexual act, something called concupiscence. And I would hope to have gotten through all of this today, but doesn't look to be the case. I'm sorry, I really need to talk less. Sorry about that. But when we come back next time, we'll just do a brief overview. Well, no, we'll do an overview of Augustine. I mean, this is at the heart of Reformed theology. And Augustine is he draws upon Paul's letter to the Romans, and just Paul's theology in general, but specifically his letter to the Romans on the bondage of the will, as Luther said, and as a result, why infant baptism is so important, and on down the line. So when we come back, we'll also begin reading chapter 7, which is really the conclusion of everything, and it gets to the question that Denny was asking: how was it that pagans and Christians were getting along at this time? And how is it the pagans were influencing Christians and vice versa? So any comments before we sign off for another week?
Dan, did I understand this correctly, that teenagers today had better engage in sex in order to acquire a soul?
Oh, no. No. I mean, we're born with souls, right? But they are sullied by well, according to Augustine, they are born in original sin. I mean, we inherit that original sin from our parents. According to Pelagius, our souls are born blameless, but I don't know how we would have. Where did you get that, Danny?
For clarification, just in case some teenager asked me.
Oh, okay. No, that's not going to happen.
Hey, okay.
Yeah. So other thoughts? Nice one to end on there. Thank you, Denny.
You're welcome.
So, okay, well, next week I will see you. And just as we're looking down the line, I think I really like Mac's suggestion that, kind of as an homage to Walter Brueggemann, who was one of the great Old Testament scholars, certainly one of the great of the 20th and the 21st century, that we read a very accessible book by him called The Prophetic Imagination. And this for two reasons. You got it. There it is. It's a wonderful book, and and focuses on an aspect of our church life that we don't often really pay much attention to, and that is the role that the prophets play in the Old Testament. And you can't understand Jesus, frankly, without understanding this prophetic tradition. And Brueggemann breaks it down very systematically and offers some good thematic lenses through which we can understand the prophets. It's not it's not as difficult a book to read as Fredrickson's. And I will also say about this is that when I've taught this book in the past, students have said it was their favorite book they read in college. It was just one of their favorites. So we got that to look forward to. So, a couple weeks on down the line,
Title again, Dan?
The Prophetic Imagination. And I've been looking, I can't find my copy with all the notes and everything in it, so I might have to just read it again and recreate notes. Yeah, this is the problem of having too many books. So anyway, I will see you all later. And sorry I didn't get through chapter 6 the way I hoped, but we'll come back. So have a nice week. See you later.